Hello and welcome to the third webinar of the Cisema webinar series for 2021 on NMPA registration of medical devices and IVDs in China. I'm Hamish.
And I'm Jackie. And today we will present on alternative entry pathways to China.
First, a bit of housekeeping. We will talk for about 50 minutes, allowing for 10 minutes Q&A at the very end. Please post questions as they come to you in the chat box, and we will then address them all in one go. The replay link will be sent to you via email in the week following the presentation. If you would like a copy of the slides, please do send us an email directly.
First, we would like to introduce Cisema to you. Cisema stands for China Service Management, and we are a regulatory affairs consultant and CRO for China. We were founded in 2002 in Munich, Germany, and Beijing, China, by a former Siemens engineer. We now have 12 offices worldwide with nearly 100 employees, most of those on the ground in China. Please sign up to our monthly newsletter on China certification, which you can do on our website.
I'm Hamish. I'm COO at Cisema. I'm a lawyer by training, admitted in New South Wales, Australia, and Hong Kong, which has been my home for the last 6 years and from where we're presenting today. I formerly worked with UK Magic Circle firm Linklaters.
And a little bit more about us. I've been working for Cisema since 2019. I've studied my bachelor's in Canada and previously worked in BOAO Veritas that specialized in testing, inspection, and certification. And also in Yahoo, where I had the opportunity to work with their global team in digital tech. Now I am the Cisema lead to support the Hong Kong and China regulatory affairs for our customers from Taiwan and Hong Kong.
So what did we learn in part one? Just going to do a brief recap here. We talked about the basics of NMPA registration. If you'd like to watch that link, it's available on YouTube. And we will post a link also in the chat box. In part two, we went into more detail about hot topics and latest regulatory changes. It was a colorful mix of different themes. I guess it emphasizes that the only constant is change, and China's regulatory environment is fast changing.
So today, we will talk about alternative entry pathways to China.
Thanks to a poll that we did last time where that was the most popular topic, and we've just set out the results here on the slide.
Yep. And about today, we will talk about the alternative entry pathways to China, which includes Order 739 and its effects on China registration, fast track pathways with NMPA itself, Hainan pilot zone, and Hong Kong listing through to Greater Bay Area sales. In the final webinar of the year, we will dive into more detail about post-market surveillance, quality management system, and software and its regulatory implications. We will also try something with your cooperation at the end of the webinar, where we will ask you to put into the chat box particular topics that you would like to be discussed in the final session. So have a think during the webinar.
Thank you, as always, for listening. This webinar series has an impressive and engaged audience. That's you. Okay, let's begin. First, we want to start with a brief reminder about the base case, by which I mean what the typical registration timeline in our experience looks like for a Class 2 and 3 medical device and IVD in China. So it's roughly 18 months for a Class 2 and 21 months for a Class 3 product. That's without any clinical trials. If a clinical trial in China is needed, and this is required, of course, by default, then it can take at least a year longer, probably more. So yes, local China clinical trials are by default mandatory for all Class 2 and 3 products, unless your product is specifically exempt. It's on an exemption list. Or you have already done a multi-center clinical trial study outside of China, and it has of sufficient scope that can support the writing of a clinical evaluation report, or you have sufficient predicate device data, that is a product that is already registered in China, to write and draft a China clinical evaluation report. Today, we are focusing on potential options to either shorten certain parts of the timeline that are bottlenecks like type testing, reduce time in the review phase or supplementary reviews phase at the regulator itself, sell unapproved devices in certain areas within China, thereby avoiding some of the cost and time altogether, or leverage off your home country approval and a simple Hong Kong listing for accelerated approvals in certain parts of China, the Greater Bay Area specifically, thereby allowing you a staged entry into China with the ability to therefore minimize your opportunity cost and allow you to obtain revenue along your entry into China, as well as give you various go, no-go decision points. I don't think we need to go into too much detail about what each of these steps are. If you want to know more, please look at our previous webinars. You can find them on our website or via Google search, and we will post a link in the chat box shortly.
So first, we would like to remind listeners about China's new top-level law for supervision and administration of medical devices. As we discussed in detail in the part 2 of our webinar series, this new law came into effect on June 1st, 2021. As you will recall, the hierarchy of laws in the PRC is laws, regulations, standards, and guidelines. This new law is also known as Order 739 because it is the 739th order passed by China's top-level body, the State Council, and replaces the existing Order 680, which dated from 2017. A short timeline of the previous top-level law is also settled on the slide on the right-hand side. While the Order 739 is now in effect, the direct impact is still being worked through. This is because the practical effect of the new law will only be clarified with various subsidiary regulations which are being implemented. In fact, there are currently 18 supporting regulations and guidelines relating to Order 739 in various stages of implementation. The only constant is change.
And yes, you heard that right, 18. There are currently 18 in draft and being implemented. So Order 739 is important in the context of understanding alternative entry pathways to China because it attempts to streamline some of the registration processes and also reinforce the accelerated approval options. Interestingly, it enshrines the possibility of self-testing reports in addition to qualified third-party testing. So that's the first item we want to alight on. And you'll recall from my earlier slide where we talked about, I highlighted the different steps in the process. This is the first one to think about. The first draft of the subsidiary regulation that clarifies further what self-testing might mean was released on June 2nd of this year, with the second draft already released on July 23. The draft states that overseas manufacturers' lab will need to be accredited by their relevant government, but must follow the on-site verification guidelines of China QMS. Our current estimation is that this could save you 2 to 4 months of the total timeline. However, it will not be possible for all devices and the cost to implement may be quite high. In fact, a recent webinar presentation that we watched with the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, RAPS, there was an interesting discussion in particular from a Roche Diagnostics regulatory affairs specialist whose view was that even for some domestic companies, implementation will be very burdensome, and only a few companies in China will be capable of implementing this themselves. But as always, it awaits to be seen what the final regulation and standards will look like. Order 739 also envisions more versatile use of clinical evidence to support clinical evaluation, including use of own predicates not yet registered in China. This would be quite an interesting change because the current predicate device route, and you may recall that I mentioned that in my previous slide or an earlier slide, the predicate device route does require very detailed information about the predicate, which is often a competitor product, and therefore you don't have access, or it's much more difficult to get the full information that you need to write this clinical evaluation report. Some other points to note: there's implied approvals for renewals contemplated, as well as implied approvals for clinical trial, to undergo clinical trials, start clinical trials. Certain Class 2 product distributions are exempted from filing requirements, and there's the possibility of conditional approvals with support of post-market data. Lab-developed tests for those IVD companies can now be imported and used under guidance of practicing physicians. As Jackie mentioned, all these top-level statements are still being clarified in many guidelines and regulations. So, as always, watch this space for the changing laws, guidelines, standards, regulations.
So on this slide, we see the formal NMPA fast-track processes: emergency approval, priority review, and innovation approval. We've also mentioned conditional approval, which is sometimes discussed separately and has been specifically addressed in Order 739-2. These have been established by the NMPA to deal with unmet medical needs in China and encourages innovation. Order 739 had a particular emphasis on innovation and envisioned faster processes for it. Regarding the registration process of fast-track approvals, applications will be allocated front-of-queue priority once accepted. As a side note, because this always causes confusion, when an application is accepted, this doesn't mean that the application is approved, but more like an indication that the reviewing process of the application will begin. The granted front-of-queue priority affects the classification, preclinical testing, QMS auditing, and CFDA reviewing or approving processes. In addition, a specially assigned NMPA officer would check in and provide guidance throughout the expedited process. Last month, on August 26th, the SAMR, State Administration for Market Regulation, announced the new administration measures Order 47 and Order 48 for the registration and filing of medical devices and IVDs, respectively, in China, that will become effective from October 1st, 2021 onwards. These are supporting regulations to Order 739. A new chapter for special registration procedures was added for both Order 47 and 48 to cover emergency approval, innovation approval, and priority review, while conditional approval was also mentioned in the chapter for product registration.
So first, innovation approval. Innovation approval is intended to encourage technological advances in R&D by providing a faster route to market. And innovation received a special emphasis in Order 739, as Jackie mentioned, meaning that early priority review with a dedicated reviewer and guidance throughout the registration process is proposed. There's no need for home country approval or country of origin approval before you apply China NMPA in the innovation approval track. And additional support is proposed for your project establishment, funding, financing, procurement, etc., as well as joint R&D, encouragement of enterprise. Some other business helpful ideas like protection of medical device IP, strengthening, as well as particular awards for individuals and institutions. In more detail, though, the product requirements that must be met to apply for innovation approval are that the working principle of the product is the first in China, where the performance and product safety is comparably better than similar products already in the market, and the product possesses internationally leading technology with stiffened clinical application. I realize I've kind of started from the bottom here on the slide, but the next point I want to mention is that there should be complete preliminary study on the prototype traceable data, and there should be a China patent. If such a product is highly needed for clinical use and considered as a product with leading technology, then the average review and approval time, in our experience, can be shortened by 2 or more months. However, the experience so far is that it is very difficult for imported devices to be accepted into the innovation approval pathways. From 2014 to 2020, a total of 99 applications for the innovation approval were granted, with only 4 of those products in nearly 6 years imported products. These were manufactured by Medtronic, Novocure, Edwards Life Sciences, and Abbott Vascular. We've set out just a little snapshot of those products on the slide, as well as included the links to the relevant NMPA announcements. It does seem, however, that there has been some momentum and increasing acceptance of innovation approvals, with 29 product applications accepted into the innovation pathway and a further 4 imported products receiving NMPA certificates via innovation approval in the last year. And these we've set out in the table on the right. But we caution companies still to manage their expectations, because 4 products is a tiny percentage of total number of medical device registrations in China.
And in the slide, the priority review procedure was implemented in 2017 for introducing medical devices that could offer treatment for a specific type of diseases, or medical devices that are listed in major or special science and technology or R&D projects of the China government. If one of the requirements are met, the product will be eligible to apply for priority review. For instance, the product should be urgently needed for clinical use while no effective diagnosis or treatment exists in China, or the product itself is able to demonstrate obvious clinical advantages during the diagnosis or treatment of rare diseases, geriatric diseases, or pediatric diseases. We've listed out the number of applications accepted and approved announced by the NMPA throughout 2017 to 2021. Although the number of applications is comparatively less than the innovation approval, there are 5 overseas applicants among the total of 11 applications accepted this year, which include Shockwave Medical, Cook Ireland, Boston Scientific, Baxalta US, and Electa.
So in order to meet any sudden urgent demands of overseas medical products, the emergency approval pathway, which is the third fast track we want to talk about, was first implemented in 2009 and again played a significant role in the coronavirus outbreak fight last year. The prerequisites for products to apply for emergency approval include that the products are intended for a public health crisis and there are no similar products currently on the China market. If there are similar products in the market, but not enough supply to meet the medical needs, then these products can apply for emergency approval as well. The emergency channel relating to the COVID-19 response was closed by mid-April last year, as the virus situation in China came under control, and in fact, no products in the past year, in the past 12 months, were approved under the emergency approval channel. When open, however, it does allow rapidly accelerated approval times, with registrations received in as soon as 5 days, and registration tests carried out within 24 hours after receiving the samples.
And this year in March, the NMPA published a draft to amend the regulation for emergency approval for the first time since the implementation in 2009. The amendment plan aims to refine the emergency approval process and suggests to add post-market research requirements, implementing lessons learned from the pandemic. We would also like to mention conditional approval briefly. This process is focused on introducing medical devices that can provide treatments that are not available in the China market yet. And the treatments must be effective for severe life-threatening diseases. The collected pre-market data should be able to provide the efficacy claim of the medical devices while providing a reasonable prediction or judgment of its clinical value in order for the medical device to apply for conditional approval. One important basic requirement is that the applicant should carry out a complete assessment on the benefit-risk ratio and residual risk of the product. The risk assessment results should always show that the benefit of the product is greater than its risk. If the product is registered and already sold in the market, However, and it is discovered that the risk of the product is greater than its benefit, or the registrant can no longer provide adequate proof of the product's safety or effectiveness, the applicant is responsible to apply for cancellation of the registration certificate. On this slide, we will move our discussion to talk about the BOAO LECHENG International Medical Tourism Pilot Zone. The pilot zone sits within the Hainan Free Trade Zone on the island of Hainan, which is like China's Hawaii. To cater for wealthy Chinese who might otherwise go abroad for their medical care, the Chinese government encouraged development of a medical tourism zone in order to benefit from a business model of having medical treatment in the top-level holiday region. The Hainan Pilot Zone was approved by the State Council in 2013 and accommodates a number of Chinese and foreign cooperative medical institutions within the roughly 20 square kilometers area. Importantly, medical devices and IVDs not otherwise registered with the NMPA can be imported into the pilot zone and sold to hospitals within the pilot zone with the approval of the Hainan Provincial NPA. Once a product is approved for use within the pilot zone, the product can, with the consent of the Hainan NPA and the NMPA, collect real-world data on Chinese nationals, which can then be used as supplementary evidence for an NMPA registration that would enable China-wide sales.
We're going to talk about what that means in a bit more detail in a second.
So hospitals within the pilot zone are closely involved in the process and would need to submit the import application to Hainan NPA. In parallel, the manufacturer applies to NMPA for real-world data approvals. There are two focus areas for NMPA with respect to such applications. The product should be urgently needed for clinical use, and there should be no products of the same variety in China. The approval relies on home country approval and is relatively straightforward.
So here on this slide are the hospitals in the Hainan pilot zone and even the contact details. Each hospital is in general focused on one department. So that gives you an idea that although it is a relatively large medical destination, it is not quite the same as a 20 million person population of the whole province of Hainan, which leads to some of the practical difficulties with collecting data within the Hainan pilot zone, which can then be used to support your real-world data application, NMPA application, and clinical trials. Just on this slide, we dived into a little bit more detail about the application for Hainan. First, the manufacturer needs to sign a contract with just one of four authorized import agents who charge a 1% agency fee. Manufacturers must provide the products to the hospitals for free, but can charge patients, although the price, of course, well, not of course, but should not be any higher than what you can achieve in the market in Hong Kong. Again, just in the final slide here, patients, that is sometimes the difficult practical effect that we're seeing in Hainan, because although in theory it's very nice to be able to sell your product to patients, there aren't that many patients in the Hainan pilot zone itself. That is the practical difficulty. And when they do come, they're tourists who come for a few days for a treatment and then leave again. So follow-up, post-clinical follow-up is very difficult as well. I think that's all we need to say on Hainan, but now I want to just talk a little bit more about what does this real-world data collection mean? That is the exciting potential, because once you go to Hainan, then how do you go to China-wide sales? You still need to go through the normal standard timeline of NMPA approval, but hopefully, if you require a clinical trial in the China-wide approval, you can reduce the numbers in that China clinical trial, or get rid of it altogether, the need for it altogether, because of the collection of real-world data. There was a November 2020 trial guideline, it's called, that NMPA released regarding the acceptance of real-world data in all NMPA applications. Real-world data means data demonstrating the function or use of the product in a clinical setting. Although in trial version, the guideline has in fact been implemented, and so it does permit applicants to draw on their real-world data evidence collected not only in some of these zones like Hainan, but also in home country to reduce your China clinical trial case numbers and or even to get rid of a need for a China clinical trial altogether. I think this is also really interesting because there is a requirement in NMPA applications for an evaluation of how the product may affect Chinese ethnic population, and sometimes clinical trials are needed to validate this. So real evidence can be very helpful, particularly if done in somewhere like Hainan, or what we think is more interesting is the Greater Bay Area, which is what we will move on to talk about now.
On the slide, we will move to dive into what we think is the more exciting alternative entry pathway to China, listing via Hong Kong to the Greater Bay Area sales. This has had a lot of momentum and recent announcements.
Yeah, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time diving into this topic and Hong Kong listing itself and what that means and how it works, because it may be less familiar to many of you, and also because it has had this recent momentum.
So on November 6th, 2019, the Hong Kong government issued a press release welcoming the 16 policy measures introduced by the central government of China. Among the 16 measures, the 7th was closely related to the future of China's healthcare and medical device industry for permitting the use of Hong Kong registered drugs and common medical devices in designated Hong Kong-owned healthcare institutions in the China Greater Bay Area. The announcement about GBA integration also referred to medical device sales, indicating that manufacturers can consider the voluntary listing in Hong Kong as a crucial entrance point to an important part of China and as a precursor to China-wide registration with the NMPA. The implementation process of the policy has steadily moved forward since then. A work plan was issued by the SAMR in September 2020, followed by the Hong Kong Chief Executive's 2020 policy address and Guangdong NPA's notice in November. It was announced that the University of Hong Kong Shenzhen Hospital will be the first institution in the Greater Bay Area to use Hong Kong registered drugs and common medical devices on a pilot basis. This pilot plan confirmed to come into force in January this year, and the completion date of the pilot plan was on July 31st, 2021. So the Guangdong NPA system is named Gangao Yao Xie Tong, which is similar to the meaning of a channel for medical devices and drug products to connect from Hong Kong and Macau to the Greater Bay Area. Upon the completion of the pilot plan, the Guangdong NPA reported that last month, in August, that the Gangao Yao Xie Tong supported the import of 9 drugs and 2 medical devices for urgent clinical use at the HKU Shenzhen Hospital. 150 patients were benefited by receiving the new medical treatment that weren't available to them in the past.
And it's interesting to see how quickly this has progressed, because it was only a couple of months ago that companies were applying to be admitted into this pilot plan. Then you had the first few drugs and medical devices announced a couple of months ago, and now it's 9 drugs and 2 medical devices. So we also just want to highlight that there are 27 Hong Kong-owned healthcare institutions within the Greater Bay Area that have been set up, which would be the target market for this plan, the Greater Bay Area sales plan. According to the Hong Kong Census and Statistics Department, just to give you some stats here, the Hong Kong's service-based industry in particular relies heavily on imports. So if you want to go to Hong Kong first, its medical equipment imports are around $22.66 billion US dollars for the last year. The data is available in 2019. Products are primarily imported from the US as the market leader. And also Hong Kong is, as is no surprise, a base for China-wide sales, accounting for around 35% of Hong Kong's medical product and equipment exports.
To give you some more context about the market opportunities, here's some data. As of today, there are already more than 6,600 medical devices listed in Hong Kong, which is a great increase of 56% compared to just what we had half a year ago. This indicates that there's a significant excitement generated about Hong Kong listing and GBA. The number of applications for Hong Kong listing is expected to increase substantially due to the Greater Bay Area developments. With the implementation of the use of Hong Kong listed medical devices, it will not only greatly impact the Greater Bay Area, but also China's healthcare and medical device industry, as it encourages innovation and further development. Therefore, we encourage our customers to list their products voluntarily with MDACS now, to ensure that they are not caught in a rush once the registration is mandatory in Hong Kong. In this slide, we also compare the population size to countries in Europe to indicate the market potential. The Hong Kong population is a bit less than Switzerland's population, for example, but the population in the Greater Bay Area already exceeds the whole population of the UK. In addition to the Chinese government's outlined development plan to improve the Greater Bay Area's quality of medical and healthcare services, the Hong Kong government has also taken a number of steps to support the Greater Bay Area development.
So on this slide, we've mapped out how Hong Kong MDACS listing through to China-wide approval will work. First, a product should be listed in Hong Kong. Having the product listed in Hong Kong will affect Hong Kong public hospitals' decisions in procurement, as well as for designated medical institutions in the Greater Bay Area itself for their procurement practices. As we talk about, listing is important also, we think, because it may become mandatory at some point in the future.
And then manufacturers will need to tender their product to the designated Hong Kong-owned hospitals in the Greater Bay Area. Currently, the designated medical institutions, they play a key role in submitting the application of Hong Kong medical devices on behalf of the applicant to obtain the Guangdong NMPA's approval. With the introduction of the Gangnao Yaoxietong system, the entire process of bringing medical devices and drugs to the Greater Bay Area from Hong Kong will speed up faster and faster over time. And it is important to recognize the value of establishing an effective communication with the GBA medical institutions.
So once the product is approved by the Guangdong NMPA to enter the Greater Bay Area market, sales in the GBA designated medical institutions can begin. This then will allow manufacturers to collect real-world data within the mainland and also test your product to see if it's popular and if you can make appropriate sales in one of the richest regions in China. So the real-world data, as I explained a little bit earlier, will be useful for evaluating ethnic differences for your NMPA application itself. And NMPA application is then made in parallel while you're relying on this real-world data collected, circumventing the need, hopefully, for entire or for a China clinical trial completely.
Just a quick overview of the current organization structure of the Hong Kong government's Food and Health Bureau. The Medical Device Control Office was established in 2004 as a division under the Department of Health. In the same year, they launched the Medical Device Administration Control System, MDACS, which features a voluntary listing system for medical devices, under which manufacturers and importers could list their medium to high-risk medical devices and IVDs with the Department of Health. In 2019, the MDCO renamed themselves as MDD, the Medical Device Division, and continues to be responsible for the MDACS and the development of a long-term statutory regulatory framework for medical devices. Both the Department of Health and the Hospital Authority are responsible to report to the Food and Health Bureau. The Hospital Authority is a statutory body managing all the government hospitals and institutes in Hong Kong. The reason for mentioning this is because they are responsible for purchasing medical devices for Hong Kong public hospitals, and medical devices commonly used in Hong Kong hospitals would be a great factor for meeting one of the requirements to enter the Greater Bay Area.
So although it's voluntary to apply for the listing of medical devices in Hong Kong, the hospital authority has a much higher preference for listed devices in public tenders, and some or many say actually they almost won't look at products that aren't listed, which is why we encourage fewer manufacturers interested in the Greater Bay Area to apply for Hong Kong listing. First, in this slide, we include a comparison table prepared by the Hong Kong Medical Device Division itself, addressing what the future might look like, or rather the sort of static future, because this device bill has been in draft for quite some time now. And that's why, well, the reason that it hasn't been implemented yet is because Hong Kong still doesn't feel that it should make product listing mandatory. It's still voluntary at this stage.
So since the launch of the MDACS system in 2004, the relevant legislation to enforce mandatory requirements was already mentioned. However, it has still not been implemented and remains in draft format. Although the final version of the medical device bill and the latest proposed version may not exactly be the same, we expect the framework will be more similar to China's current regulatory regime. We expect some changes in the terminologies used, for instance, from listing to registration, and local responsible person to authorized representative, as seen in the slide. According to the current MDACS system in Hong Kong, it is based on the principles of medical devices classification proposed by the IMDRF, the International Medical Devices Regulators Forum. Medical devices and IVDs are separately grouped into 4 classes according to the risk level associated with their intended use. Class 4 medical devices and Class D IVDs, they bear the highest risk, whereas Class 1 medical devices and Class A IVDs, they bear the lowest risk. One interesting fact is that the China regulatory body, NMPA, they are one of the IMDRF Management Committee members. And last year in October, the IMDRF accepted a proposal on post-market clinical follow-up studies, which shows a growing global leadership and maturity of the Chinese regulator and the Chinese medical device industry. Set out on this slide is a simple overview of the application process for listing medical devices in Hong Kong. Applications require at least 22 weeks of processing time. If the manufacturer wishes to apply for inclusion of a device into the list of medical devices, but does not have a registered place of business in Hong Kong, the company must designate a local responsible person that must have a valid Hong Kong business registration certificate. Therefore, similar to many global regulatory systems, including the China NMPA, CE mark in Europe, US FDA, a local presence is required. In Hong Kong, only the medium to high-risk medical devices and IVDs can be listed on the MDACS system, which means Class 1 medical devices and Class A IVDs won't be able to apply for listing. Successful device applications will receive a listing number and be listed in the MDACS online database. The listing will be valid for 5 years. As of today, there is still no application fee for listing medical devices on the MDACS system. However, foreign manufacturers should expect the cost for appointing a local responsible person in Hong Kong. This is something we at Cisema regularly do for our customers. The benefits of appointing a regulatory affairs specialist as your LRP includes collecting the required documents for dossier submission, handling post-market matters, and maintaining effective communication with the manufacturer, the government official, and other related parties. In this slide, we've provided a breakdown of the application particulars for MDACS listing. I would like to share some practical tips from common problems based on the experience we've had with our clients for their application. The Hong Kong Medical Devices Division can be quite strict with the contact information details that are stated on the documents, such as the manufacturer's address. Since certificates like the ISO 13485 and other foreign market approval certificates, they will have the manufacturer's address printed on it. However, this may not always be up to date. For example, the manufacturer may have relocated to a different address, but still be waiting for the certificate issuing body to provide the certificate with the updated information. The applicant will have to ensure all the required documents for dossier submission are up to date. Otherwise, additional processing time may occur. If you refer to the particulars of the device in the table, the conformity assessment certificates is optional for some cases when the applicant's marketing approval certificate does not meet the MDACS requirement.
And here is an overview of how much time applicants can expect to complete their application for the medical device or IVD listing in Hong Kong. 5 months is the total estimated timeline. Most of that is the review process. There's not too much to talk about or point out in detail, but this gives you a general idea that it's a fairly straightforward, linear process, document-based only.
And in this slide, we've listed the related measures that were also mentioned in the beginning slides. And now we will talk about the responsibilities of the different departments involved to support the GBA pilot plan. According to the pilot plan that was announced last year in November, the registration of medical devices in the GBA will be approved and administered by the Guangdong NMPA instead of the NMPA. The GBA medical institutions must be designated by the Guangdong Health Commission for using medical devices imported from Hong Kong. The designated medical institutions must be healthcare service providers from Hong Kong or Macau in the form of sole proprietorship and equity or cooperative joint ventures in the GBA. The University of Hong Kong Shenzhen Hospital will be the first to test run the medical devices before the policy extends to cover more designated healthcare institutions, drugs, and medical devices. The China State Council authorizes the Hong Kong Department of Health, as well as Guangdong's NMPA and Health Commission, to administer and constantly update the approved list of imported medical devices. The Guangdong NMPA is the key responsible body supported by the other departments listed here in the table below.
So a big step forward was actually announced last month in August, when the Guangdong NMPA issued the finalized version of the interim measures for importing medical devices that are urgently needed for clinical use from Hong Kong and Macau to the Greater Bay Area. Bit of a mouthful, but this is the name of the release. The measures will be valid for 3 years, and applicants should refer to this finalized version of the interim measure to ensure the products are eligible to apply for this pathway. Comparing to the previous draft version announced in June, the draft originally specified medical devices applying for this pathway must be a product that cannot be replaced by already registered medical devices in China. What's very interesting is that this requirement has now been removed, that suggests a lowering of the bar and an opening up of the potential applicants. The Guangdong NMPA also held a press release last month to introduce 4 newly designated medical institutions, in addition to the Hong Kong University Shenzhen Hospital that Jackie's mentioned earlier, which was the original pilot plan hospital. Also, as mentioned in one of the announcements by Cisema last year, we just would like to point out that basic integration of Hong Kong medical devices in GBA medical institutions is expected by 2022. That's next year.
According to the specified prerequisites to apply for GBA approval, the product scope covers medical devices urgently needed for clinical use. The intended use must be clearly defined by the designated medical institutions in the Greater Bay Area during the application process. The medical devices must also be procured and already operating in the public hospitals in Hong Kong or Macau. Last but not least, the medical device itself must be considered as possessing advanced technology in its clinical application. Once the dossier submission is considered as complete, the Guangdong NMPA will first take 5 working days to form a special task force to work with the Guangdong Health Commission, which will take 15 additional working days to carry out the application review. The Guangdong Health Commission will then provide comments to the Guangdong NMPA. After receiving the comments, the Guangdong NMPA will take 15 more working days to decide and announce the results of the application. Therefore, the application process will take at least 35 working days in total after the dossier submission is completed, which is a lot faster than the usual NMPA registration process, unless applicants are yet to go through the application process for Hong Kong listing. Once the product is approved for importing into the Greater Bay Area, the registration will be valid for a year. If any product recalls or adverse events were to occur, the designated medical institutions hold the responsibility to make arrangements and report to the local NMPA. In this slide, we've also included the first medical equipment introduced by the HKU Shenzhen Hospital that obtained the GBA approval. It's a magnetically controlled growing titanium rod for treating scoliosis. As of August this year, we know that 3 patients have already underwent successful surgeries, and so far no issues were reported.
I've just skipped one here because this is our last summary slide that we put together, really just drawing together what we've talked about today in a nice graphic. Jackie, do you mind taking us through?
Yeah, so we've talked about the recent finalization of policy measures regarding the introduction of medical devices from Hong Kong to the Greater Bay Area. We've also covered the qualifications and processes and show how listing medical devices in Hong Kong can help overseas manufacturers with their China market entry.
Yeah, and we also talked about Hainan Pilot Zone, a similar but unique pathway for innovative medical devices to enter China. And we discussed in some detail Order 739, China's new top-level law on medical device and IVD, which is being felt throughout the entire process as it streamlines and emphasizes some of these fast-track and innovative approvals.
We've also talked about the existing fast-track channels with NMPA, such as the innovation approval, priority review, emergency approval, and conditional approval. As medical device manufacturers, you may be asking, what are the implications of the information we covered today, or why is it important to me?
And the implications are that no matter your medical device or IVD product, it all starts with your regulatory pathway for China. It's your foundation step to entering this burgeoning market. It can't just be treated as a any other distribution market where you set and forget. There are various alternative entry pathways, as we've outlined, and these can be considered as part of your registration strategy. But China's ever-changing regulatory environment can always make you feel like you're shooting at a moving target, so it's important to have sufficient resources and attention allocated to this. One way you can do that is by signing up to our monthly newsletter, and you can find that on our website.
We hope you enjoyed our presentation and look forward to connecting via email or LinkedIn. And please mark your diaries for our final webinar in the series of this year on Thursday, December 2nd, 2021 at 10 a.m. Central European Time.
So thank you everybody for joining us. It's a pleasure as always to speak, and we look forward to connecting before our next webinar or in one of the other frequent webinars that we join throughout the year, or by email, of course, and sign up to our newsletter. Thank you for joining. Have a nice day.